You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Cliff Berg. Cliff is co-founder and managing partner of Agile Hr Academy. Cliff is an Agile and DevOps advisor and consultant, and he is one of the authors of the book titled Agile Hr, the Next Iteration of Agile. Today, Cliff and I are discussing the strengths of Agile, its possible weaknesses, and ways to address them. We'll also explore signs of Agile thinking at Elon Musk's companies, SpaceX and Tesla. Cliff, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here.
For me too. Thank you. So in 2001, 17 software developers descended from a mountain with a document they titled Manifesto for Agile Software Development. What is Agile software development?
Well, you'll get very different answers depending on who you ask. The term Agile, of course, is an English language term. So, we can look at it from that perspective, the generic meaning of Agile. The way I tend to view Agile, when someone talks about Agile in the context of the Agile movement, the Agile development process, whatever, to me, that's a proper noun. I know that Dave Thomas has said, no, it's not a proper noun, it's an adjective. Yeah, it's an adjective, but it's also a proper noun. Dave can't do anything about that. I love Dave, he's great, but it is what it is. It's become a proper noun because there is an Agile movement. There is the Agile Manifesto. There are Agile practices and Agile teams. The word has come to mean something. It's come to mean a lot of things. So, when we talk about Agile, we're really talking about all of that stuff. And it's distinct from the word Agile in the dictionary. In fact, some dictionaries now have Agile in the context of Agile software development as a second meaning.
Right.
As a second meaning. It's not the same meaning. So, it depends. And, if your focus is on Agile practices, then that's what you mean. If your focus is on the Agile movement, that's what you mean. If it's on the Agile Manifesto, then that's what you mean. So the word is somewhat ambiguous. And we need to be clear about what we actually mean when we say it.
So Canadian business academic Henry Mintzberg talks about the fallacy of prediction and formalization. Sometimes strategies must be left as broad visions, not precisely articulated to adapt to a changing environment. So that phrase brings to me maybe small a agile and maybe even capital A agile. I'm going to make a statement here and you can correct me on it because I'm making a few assumptions here. But in my mind, iterative methods and I classify agile as an iterative method, agile, lean startup, design thinking, they all seem to be built on the assumption that we don't know everything and we never will. So instead of planning, we should start experimenting. So first of all, you can correct me if some of that is wrong, but also, is planning dead?
Absolutely not. Planning is really important, but we have to remember that plans are plans. There are intention. If you don't plan, you have no intention. What are you going to do? I plan every morning. I look at my to-do list and I move things to the top. And that it's a running to-do list, and some of my plans go way out into the future. But I look at those with skepticism, but if you don't have a plan, you don't have a direction. Mm-hmm. You have to know where you're headed. I think you mentioned SpaceX in the beginning, and our book uses SpaceX as one of the case studies for a reason. One of the reasons being it's not software, but it's highly agile in the way it operates. And they have a plan, but they're highly agile. What makes plans not effective is when you view them as final decisions, where the plan is the plan and we have to stick to the plan no matter what. And that's when the plan becomes a problem rather than a help.
So what my interpretation of Agile, I think You've actually sort of commented on the possibility that waterfall wasn't the dominant project management approach in all of history. But my interpretation of the Agile Manifesto was that it was a reaction to waterfall.
Yeah.
So I guess one thing I want to sort of examine is the possibility that all we're really saying is don't plan so far, because a sprint is really a short waterfall. And the challenge, I think, becomes if we think to ourselves, instead of making it a 1-year project, let's make 2 6-month projects so that we can get a handle on it and get a new vista after 6 months. The problem is that if you're in a fairly large organization, you can have multiple sprints going on at once. So you've got not only the challenge of shrinking duration, but also of integrating the different changes that are going on. How does Agile help address that?
Well, again, it depends what you mean by Agile. And people in the community have very different views, would give different answers to that. One point I like to make very often when I have the opportunity is that the predominant thinking within the Agile community has very much diversified and changed. If you look at standard narratives from from the first decade and compare them with widely accepted narratives in the second decade today, they're markedly different. The original books were, about extreme programming and Scrum, but the books people talk about today are like Turn the Ship Around by Dave Marquette, who was a submarine commander.
Yes.
And Nicole Forsgren's Accelerate, which is, mostly about DevOps and organization culture. So, and Accelerate has a whole chapter about leadership in it. Early Agile was very skeptical of the whole idea of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you look at today, I see Agile, one of the premier Agile training organizations, they have a whole business agility curriculum. It's mostly about leadership. So who you ask, some people still very much embrace the early Agile ideas, and other people embrace more recent thinking, which I think is much more solid and much more realistic. So what's Agile is very important. You mentioned that sprints, and a sprint is a short waterfall. Well, I would say that, that's a smell, and to use Agile vernacular, the fact that it's a short waterfall. I don't understand personally the need for sprints. I don't get it. If you're 3 weeks in, if you're 3 days into working on a feature and you discover that feature actually is not the best feature or is not a good approach, stop working on that feature. Don't wait till the end of the sprint in order to replan. Replan right then. If you notice an impediment, don't wait for the stand up the next morning. Raise it right then. In listening to, you had sent me before this interview a link to an interview of
Dr. Dan Rasky.
Dan Raskin, who runs the COTS program at NASA. COTS doesn't stand for commercial off the shelf. It stands for Commercial Orbit Transportation System at NASA. And it's an incubator program and to help startups to build, space systems. And he talks there about when he spent a year at SpaceX, and he contrasts it with NASA, and he talks about how they would deal with issues instantly. That if something came up, you never waited. You found the people who needed to be involved in the discussion, and you went to them right then. You pivoted immediately. So there's SpaceX is highly agile, but and they plan. They definitely plan, but all plans are tentative, and their decisions, as he states it, are made based on 51% confidence. If you're 51% confident, you make the decision and you start and you measure. And then if things don't work out, to use his word, you backtrack.
Right.
But you don't wait. and you don't try to make plans perfect, but you do plan. So, I think we need to get rid of this idea of an artificial cadence where like every 2 weeks or every program increment or every, like, what is that for? What value does that add? I'm a big fan of continuous processes and continuous adjustment, more of a flow perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree. Although I will say that I think there's a natural tendency when we talk about an organization. Often the way you organize things is by dividing them up. When I throw things into a dresser, there's different drawers, and some things go in this drawer, and some things, of course, that won't always work season to season because my long pants won't all fit. So you have to rethink the divisions that you have. But the divisions can be time-based, like we're going to do everything in 2-week chunks or quarterly or whatever. It can be divisions like engineering's over here and sales is over here. It could be we have a division in Australia and one in England and one in Canada, right? And so often if you're in a stable environment, the divisions you have, they work and they continue to work. But when things are unstable or there's new opportunities, that's when you have to be consciously rethinking what those divisions are. And that's one of the things I thought was really what excited me about Agile too, to the extent that I've read about it. It's very pragmatic, and it says, that I think almost the first words in the whole document. Let me say, I left it to the end here, but the only general principle is it depends, which I love, but it means it does it puts the same onus that Elon Musk puts on us, which is first principles, right? And so, sorry, I'm meandering a little bit. I'll throw it back to you in a sec, but you can't spend your entire life thinking first principles because you'll never get anywhere. You have to sort of set rules of thumb and then move on. So what do you think? I get the impression that Agile 2, in inviting us to think for ourselves, is reacting to the existence of systems. There's some tension there, though, right? Systems can work for a while. So how do you address that? How do you think through that tension?
Yeah. So a good example is frameworks. Frameworks are good. Like SAFe has some good stuff in it, but I think the wrong way to use those things, or Scrum or any of these things, is to view it as like a template and just try to execute it. We should look at these things as sources of ideas. Like in SAFe, I like the portfolio Kanban idea. I wouldn't implement it exactly like that. I wouldn't. I would think, what am I trying to do? What are we trying to do? And how can we solve that problem? And SAFe gives us a model that might inspire our thinking. But now we need to figure out what we want to do. And it might bear some resemblance, or it might be quite different, or it might have some elements of it in it. But we should come up with our own. We should use it as a source of ideas. And if you want to get consultants who specialize in that, that's great. But they should be consultants. They shouldn't be coming and implementing something rote. Your organization. You have ownership of your organization. You understand your organization. If you don't own the problem, you're not going to understand the solution. You're not going to invest in the solution. You're not going to be able to revise the solution when things don't work out, because they always don't work out. Things always need adjustment. Everything always depends.
Yeah.
So, if now someone has implemented something rote, you don't really understand why it's that way. You haven't built the mental model that you need to be able to tweak it and adjust it and everything. So I believe that, first principles are an important starting point, but then you build up a history, and you build up things that have worked for you. So you're not always starting over. One of the things we do mention in Agile 2 actually is that, in an organization that has many teams, when you stand up a new team, there should be a checklist of things that a team should think about, that it should be doing or should have. But it shouldn't be like a checklist of things they must have or must be doing. It should be a set of ideas, because what the team's building might be very different, might be unique. So I mean, the way you build one kind of thing might be very different from how you build another thing. The way you build a microservice is very different from how you build a mobile app. So these, you're right. You shouldn't always start from scratch, but you should always own the problem. You should always, you should always make your own first cut, and it's going to be wrong, and that's okay. But you start small, you experiment, you start it in a safe context, so that when it doesn't work out that well, you're still okay, you're still alive, everyone's still alive, and you ask for help, you ask for suggestions, you talk it through, and then you improve.
So as you led off with that, it made me think that the idea that we can take an existing framework that was designed around probably a circumstance that happened, somewhere else and at a different time, it's almost infantilizing, because you aren't creating your own process. And if you aren't creating your own process, then you can't adjust it. So the challenge there, again, and sort of the counterpoint to the idea that you shouldn't have to go first principles on everything, is that over time you develop a legacy of things that work where you are and when you are, that may not last. How do you recognize when your legacy of frameworks and practices and everything else is starting to fail an organization?
Well, you will if you're paying attention. If you stop paying attention, and if you stop measuring outcomes, and if you stop asking questions and looking at what's happening out among people who are using the product and so on, if you're not asking good questions, if you're asking is our product working well, they'll probably say yes, yes, yes. But you need to be asking more open-ended questions, quote unquote open questions, like what would you really like to have? What things are you looking at? And I'd like to, just tilt it back a little bit to what we were talking about just before, because there's a related thing that's very important, about processes, that when you end up with a process, what makes it work is not the process. The process is not really what matters. What matters is that in the minds of the people who are using the process, they've built mental models of cause and effect relationships of how things work. And from the outside, it looks like they're following this process. But what's really happening is in their minds, they're making decisions, because it always depends. They're making decisions, and they're making creative actions and doing things. And if you just define the process for them, they don't have the mental models they need to do all that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the process is kind of like, they kind of don't know how to do the process. They can go through the motions, but they're not really doing it. They're kind of faking it. It's cargo cult. They're checking the boxes, but they're not making good decisions. They're not making good creative actions. The process is not what matters. I mean, what matters is the knowledge and the behaviors. Like you can have a process for collaboration. Okay, what does that look like? Well, in the Agile community, it's always a meeting or a live discussion. Real collaboration actually is talking, listening, reading, writing, and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's real collaboration over time. But if you were to just define a process, like, okay, first we talk, then we write, then we read, then, people would do that. They go through the motions, but it wouldn't work well.
Mm-hmm.
What makes it work well is when people collaborate effectively because they know how, because they have a high EQ, and they learn how to listen well to others, and they've learned how to articulate things and have dialectic discussions. So, the process is not what matters. If you have people who have the right skills, they'll come up with a process.
Right.
The process is the end point. It's not the starting point.
Yeah, it reminds me of I have a recipe for pizza. I make pizza from scratch. And when you move from house to house and you're in a different oven, the temperature is not quite right. There are things that change. And if all you're doing is following the recipe, you may have burnt pizza every time. And if you don't have the knowledge to know what to tweak, what to play with, you're stuck. So yeah, I can certainly see the need to be able to adjust.
Let me pivot on that if I could,
Yeah.
on that example, because that example, I'd like to make a point there, that making a pizza in your oven, you don't have to make any decisions because you know it works. So it's a repeatable process. It's like manufacturing the same product.
Yeah.
But product development's not like that.
No.
Development, you're always making something different. The product's always changing. That's the whole point. Otherwise, you wouldn't need engineers. So it's product development is like if every time you make that pizza, you go to a different house. You never make it twice in the same house.
Right.
Same oven. And so you're always deciding, you're always adjusting. And so if you just follow the process, you'll always have crappy pizza.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I don't want to belabor pizza because it's just making me hungry. But when you think of what one tends to do if you cook pizza every weekend, for example, is you assemble your ingredients, you turn on the oven before you start, you roll out the dough while somebody else is shredding the cheese. You get very lean. You get into the whole lean space, which is really thinking through the step-by-step process. And that, I think, is another tension is between this idea of agility and being able to change your mind and change your process and even change your product runs up against the people who are like, I'm in the middle of optimizing things here. So there's that tension between effectiveness, coming up with the right thing, and efficiency, doing the same thing over and over again. Where does lean brush up against agile in your view? How do you address that tension?
Yeah. So again, it's a judgment call. It depends. There is no like permanent fixed process for it, even for a given product, because products change over time.
Mm-hmm.
People need to decide, and that's where a template falls down, because these are always trade-offs. Like how much testing should you do? It depends. It depends on what kinds of things you might fail. And what the cost of failure is, and what your actual quality is today. Are you testing enough? So, there is a constant tension over repeatability and innovation. How much work do our feedback loops add to us? Mm-hmm. How much time should we spend in improving those so that they run really quickly and smoothly versus time spent on getting a new feature out. Those are trade-offs. There isn't one answer, and people have to be making judgments about those things. It's not a process. It's you should be in the process. In the process, I don't know an alternative word, but because coming up with processes is a process.
Yes.
And in the process of figuring out what to do in product development, you have to, you look at how you have been doing it. What are your pipeline, your delivery? What are your delivery pipelines? I like to call them, your product conceptualization, product design, and product engineering and value delivery stream for a mouthful. Because it's different from the customer value stream. That's right. How the customer uses the product. But anyway, that delivery stream, how are you designing that over time? How are you changing that and pivoting that over time? Those are judgment calls.
So I make no secret of my fascination with SpaceX and Tesla, and one of the reasons I was excited to have you on the show is you are an agile expert. Small a, big A, agile 2, whatever. You're in the agile space. And you wrote an article talking about agile at SpaceX. And to sort of kick things off, one of the things in it that you argue is that the space tech industry has been stuck in a loop for 40 years. How so?
Oh, my God. Well, Mr. Raskin echoes that. He talks about when he was a teenager, and he and his friends saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was 1968 when they saw that, and then the next year we landed on the moon, and everybody back then just assumed that by the year 2000 we would have big orbiting space stations and bases on the moon and Mars and all kinds of things, and then nothing happened. So there are a lot of people who feel let down, and there are some individuals who have kind of rekindled the dream, so to speak. Elon Musk is one of them. Jeff Bezos is another. And this is not about lauding individuals. This is about just being grateful that this industry has come back to life. And SpaceX is, I think, really a fantastic example of agility. Number one, they don't use any methodology. You'd never hear the word Scrum mentioned. What they do is they number one, they never wait. If something needs to happen, there's a famous example, and we have to remember that not everyone's SpaceX, and not everyone should be SpaceX or Tesla, because when people are working for an organization that has like a dream and a goal to do something great, they'll work 80 hours a week.
Yeah,
they want to. They're not being exploited. They want to do that. So imagine if there's a humanitarian organization that's trying to feed starving people. The people working for that might work 80 hours a week because they want, they're trying to change the world. Well, SpaceX is trying to change the world. So yeah, people work long hours, but that's not the aspect that I highlight when I write about SpaceX. Yes, that is true, but what makes them interesting to me is not how much they work, but how they work. They never wait to do things. There's a famous example where at a new facility that they had built in Texas, and the progress was slow, and Elon Musk arrived and called an all-hands meeting, which was about 200 people or so. And, Elon Musk style, the meeting happened to be at 1 a.m. on Saturday night.
Yes.
Attendance was mandatory.
Yeah.
But again, that's because you're working for a startup that has a dream. So ordinarily it would be during business hours. But the point is, he didn't say, oh, you all suck, you work harder. He didn't say that. He said, how can we go faster?
Yeah.
And people said, we need more people. And he said, oh, well, in fact, now they have 3 shifts. They have 3 8-hour shifts. The hourly people at SpaceX don't work long hours unless they volunteer to. It's the salary people who do. But, the people who are building that rocket in Texas, the welders and people on the ground, they work in shifts. And so they created an additional shift. Now they have 3 shifts. And he said, well, how many people do we need? And they said, and this is at that stand-up meeting in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And they said, we need to double our workforce. And he said, okay, well, we'll meet here tomorrow at 8 a.m. and we'll figure that out. So Sunday morning, they planned a hiring effort that happened on Monday and Tuesday, and by Wednesday they had doubled their workforce.
Wow.
So, they don't wait. There's no cadence, there are no sprints. They do things, as soon as they decide to do something, they do it right then. So, I don't celebrate doing it in the middle of the night. I think people need lives and so on. But what I do celebrate is not waiting, that if something needs to be done, you don't just put it on the list for the next time we're going to meet for the monthly, whatever. No, call the people now, say, how soon can you talk? Who needs to be involved? It shouldn't be everybody, because then it won't happen until 3 weeks from now. Right. So who needs to be involved? Have the discussion, make a decision.
So the term moonshot is often used synonymously with the idea of a Hail Mary. It's, a huge leap into the unknown, a last gasp effort. In fact, the Apollo program was crawl, walk, run. It was, very rigorous about increasing the elaboration and the ambition of each mission, and each one built on the one before.
Very
How
much.
does this compare to the SpaceX approach?
It's actually not too different. And, the Apollo program is kind of fascinating because, today we think of NASA as bureaucratic, but back then it was a very different organization. And if you look at the Apollo program, it went through phases very deliberately. It had a chief architect, Werner von Braun, and, it had a plan and a vision, and it pivoted too. First there was Project Mercury, and Project Mercury, the goal was to see if we could safely and repeatedly put human beings in orbit.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. That was it. And once we did that, then Project Gemini was to see what can we do in orbit. And so they practiced spacewalks, they practiced docking, and it was always two people. That's why they called it Gemini. So they basically want to see if they could operate in space. And then Apollo was prototyping the actual system that would take them to the moon and back. And there were a series of those, of progressive demonstration of capability. SpaceX works in a very similar way, in that if you ask Elon Musk, another thing about Elon Musk, and again, I don't want to celebrate an individual here. I'm really talking about kind of the perspective and the
approach. Yeah.
Yeah, the approach is that, to him, every issue is a business issue. And he doesn't claim to be the best rocket engineer in SpaceX. In fact, he started out knowing nothing about rockets. He hired Tom Mueller from TRW and said, he didn't say you do the rockets and I'll do the business. He said, teach me about rockets.
Yeah.
And he learned. He's interested, and he has discussions and asks questions. And if you ask him, how are you going to get to Mars? He'll tell you what all the critical points are, what all the bottlenecks are, and what number is the decider of whether or not it can be done. Yeah. The cost of a pound to orbit, the cost of a pound to Mars, the thickness of the steel in that rocket. They went from 4 to 3. I've forgotten it. 4 centimeters to 3 centimeters. I think I'm probably wrong, but he can tell you all the key metrics. And there's a paradigm in business, the one metric that matters. But people misuse that. It's not one metric above everything. It's for each cluster of issues, what's the one metric that kind of makes or break that issue?
Right.
And he knows them all. He knows them all. And the people who work there know them. They know they're working on this. They know they got to get that metric. They know there's a target metric. Otherwise, it won't work. And so it's always a demonstration of capability. He wants to demonstrate they can refuel in orbit. He wants to demonstrate that the Starship vehicle can take off and land. He wants to demonstrate that they can put the Starship vehicle in orbit. He wants to demonstrate that it then can re-enter and survive. He wants to demonstrate that it can reach Mars. Then he wants to demonstrate, yes, it can actually land on Mars. And then so he views it as these series of capability demonstrations, just like NASA did.
One of the things that strikes me is, we say moonshot, but in my view, the shuttle was more of a moonshot than Apollo, because it was this commitment to an extremely complex and unproven approach to putting stuff into orbit. That there was almost no prototyping involved. It was the first time they launched was crude. They had people on board the very first time they launched, and they stayed committed to that design almost throughout. I mean, there were refinements, of course, but it was a real departure from this. They could have put an orbiter with wings on top of the Saturn V to try it out. There were all kinds of opportunities to try in incremental fashion, and they wound up with something that was so expensive and unworkable and unfortunately unsafe. they really lost their way. And it seems like they've sort of taken the view, well, we're just going to do commercial instead, at least for the launch market.
Yeah, well, Rasky talks about, he called it sparse matrix versus full matrix. What he explained he meant by that was that NASA gradually moved from an approach of gradually trying to prove capabilities to an approach of design the whole final thing and develop a risk mitigation strategy for each potential problem area. And don't build anything until you've checked every box and addressed every risk.
Which is, in my view, at least, a true definition of waterfall.
Absolutely.
Perfect your design and then fly it exactly the way you want the first time.
Yeah, and good luck with that.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, yeah, you do need luck with that.
And these ideas aren't new. If you go back to Skunk Works, Lockheed Martin, people knew how to do this better. Skunk Works was all about prototyping and partnership between customer and vendor rather than a tug of war relationship. It was about experimentation and
small diverse team.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Kelly Johnson actually enumerated, I think there are 12 principles that he followed, and they're very written in the context of contracting, government, because like one of the principles is about having flexible contracts, and but if you really kind of read between the lines, it's very agile.
Well, that is another fascinating subject, is the whole contract that is done with other rocket companies. The way contracts are structured, they're often cost plus. They often one of the things that Dan Rasky talked about was when he was at SpaceX, the requirements document was, we need to get to orbit and back. Something to that effect, right? It was very straightforward. It wasn't a 100-page document explaining every rivet. But one interesting thing he said later on was that he's seeing more of that kind of rigor at SpaceX with more requirements documents. And this comes back to the idea, or the challenge, I think, that on the one hand, a legacy is a powerful thing to have. A legacy is a bunch of stuff that works, right? But the problem is that when you want to make a change, you are now disturbing things that work. And so there is more rigor required. I want to sort of talk about that a little bit with you, because I think Agile 2 or Agile 2 is meant to encompass all kinds of organizations. But it strikes me that as organizations get larger and more successful and older, there's a tendency for that agility to kind of ossify. It's almost unavoidable. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a way for a company to avoid getting tied up in its own success and adherence to the way it succeeded before?
Yeah, well, there is, but that there's so many elements of that. The root is the culture of the organization. There needs to be a culture of the right kind of leadership. And if you have that, you'll end up with well-aligned incentives. Rasky points out that at SpaceX, that they have very well-aligned incentives because there's a clear vision and mission, and even if you just work on a certain program, which usually people do, they work on the Falcon 9, or they work on the Starship, or they work on the Dragon capsule, or they work on Starlink. You're working for one program, but the goal is get that thing to orbit or whatever.
Right.
And they purposefully underpay people, according to Rasky, but give them substantial stock option compensation so that their natural, at least financial incentive, is make this stuff work rather than And he gives an example of how there was one team that had to ask another team to like weaken its design, in order to accommodate what the first team wanted. And they said, they ran the numbers and sure, no problem, because it helped meet the overall goal. In a large established company, you tend to have fiefdoms develop. And if managers are competitive, view things in a zero-sum way, they won't let anyone encroach on their design or their part of the product or their product or whatever, so there won't be this cooperation. There will be, so a competitive culture is really kind of the root problem there. And, culture, culture is so important, but one problem in the Agile community is that we talk about it a lot, but we don't really say what we mean by it. And, sometimes you hear the word mindset, but also culture. But culture is actually something that's been studied very rigorously for a long time. There are very well established, validated culture models. And so, I reached out to, I did some research and picked what I thought was the best one, and I reached out to them. It's called Human Synergistics. It was founded by a man named Dr. Robert Cook. He's a professor emeritus, and their culture model has 12 dimensions, and you can do a survey of people, and you can actually characterize and profile an organization's culture. You get a tremendous amount of information by doing that, and then you can really see clearly, like, well, this is why their transformation is not going well.
Yeah,
it's obvious, because we can see here they have a competitive culture, and so of course different groups aren't giving and taking. They're not working together that well, and people are trying to climb the ladder, and so culture is really important, but you need to do more than just say, "Oh, improve your culture." That's not actionable. It's not helpful.
Right.
You need to actually tell them how to do that, and tell them how to measure that, and then how to strategize about that. Internally competitive culture is one way that over time organizations start to ossify, as you said.
So I love that, because you're sort of picking on a theme that I'm fascinated with, and that is that almost any impulse an organization could have is adaptive under certain circumstances. And so your culture evolves to be appropriate, probably for I agree, there can be decay, there can be corruption, there's all kinds of problems that can happen. But if your culture is, for example, we're very inclusive and we're always going to engage one another on decisions, that will give that is optimized for a certain set of circumstances. But if you want to compete with Elon Musk, maybe you need to rethink that, right? And so I like the idea of sort of all these things often are breaking it up and then putting it back together again, and the idea of having 12 metrics to look at for a culture, I think are very useful. I imagine one of them is how quickly you're able to make decisions versus how inclusive you are. There must be something along those lines in that list.
Well, that's more along the lines of behavior,
Okay.
So, Agile 2, there's actually an Agile 2 assessment. And that will reveal that, because it's agility, and, so how quickly can you make decisions? But, the culture will be more about if people are supportive, or if they tend to just do what they're told versus think for themselves, and those kinds of things. But, an important thing is not, even an organization has a culture, but not everybody's the same in the organization.
Yeah.
And it can't be, or it won't work well. If everybody were the same, it would not function well. The most important, the most impactful individuals in an organization, this is an area that makes the Agile community uncomfortable. The idea that people have different roles, but it's the reality when you have a large organization. It has to be, or it won't work. And the people who have leadership roles are the most impactful as individuals. And they can't all be the same, or that won't work well either. As Peter Drucker said, you need an inside person, an outside person, and a person of action in any group.
Yeah.
And, the culture of the organization might be a certain way, but certain individuals have certain personalities and leadership strengths. Other individuals have other personalities and other leadership strengths. The outside person is like, the classic example is the CEO who like gives interviews and portrays the company is doing this, and we're trying to change the world, and we're trying to do this and that, and gets investors. And the inside person is someone who the people in the organization trust, and that person kind of relates to them, and they relate to that individual. And often that person has technical leadership too, kind of maybe was a founder or kind of knows the subject matter really well. And then the person of action is what I like to call a nudger, someone who's like saying, well, what's in our way? What are we doing today? What are we doing tomorrow? And can we do that today instead of tomorrow? How can I help? What's slowing us down? Because people will dawdle,
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the gaps with self-organization is there's no nudger. There needs to be someone constantly putting gentle pressure to keep things moving in a positive way, not a fear-based way, but in a positive way. So you have your culture, but you have individuals too. And some people in the organization need to be highly competitive in an externally facing mode, because companies have competitors.
Mm-hmm.
You need very aggressive salespeople. You might not want to work with them, but you need to have them.
Yeah. Well, the way you said that reminds me of another sort of personal fascination I have. Have you heard of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Of course, yeah.
Have you read it?
I actually have never read that.
Okay, it's a shame. I will explain. I will share with you one story from it that might encourage you to read it. So there's this planet called Golgafrincham, and they decide that they want to get rid of all their hairstylists and middle managers and tax accountants and all the people they think are useless. And so they artificially create a crisis where they're going to say, okay, we're going to build 3 arcs. One arc is full of the people who actually get stuff done. One is full of the people who lead, and the other is full of all the middle people.
Those are all the fun people.
Yeah.
The
well, the thing is, what happened is they tricked the B arc people, the middle arc people, and they all abandoned Golgafrincham and, of course, settled the planet Earth, which is why we're the way we are, right? And I actually, now, as it turns out, Elon is a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide. Right. And I actually think that he kind of has a B arc view, a dismissive view of HR. And you can sort of see that in the scandals that come out of SpaceX and Tesla. A more muscular HR department would probably stamp out a lot of the problems that they have. Oh. But the other thing is, there's this presumption that self-organization will take care of everything, right? Which is why it doesn't always work. And that's why you sometimes see him coming in and screaming at people, right?
I don't see, and I don't work at SpaceX, so I've studied them a lot. And maybe some things I don't, and I've read the books about them. But in the book Liftoff by Eric Berger, he describes in there, and he interviewed people who worked for founders, and there were some incidents where Elon kind of got very agitated, but it didn't sound to me like he was like a toxic person who would storm in and like make everybody miserable. It didn't sound like that. It sounded like they were under a lot of stress. And like a good example is, Tom Mueller designed their first rocket engine, and it didn't work. I don't know if you read the book, but he chose to use an ablative combustion chamber design.
Yeah.
And over time, it led to one problem after another. And now a year later, Musk says to him, okay, Tom, so you built me an engine that's too heavy, that is unreliable, it's not reusable, and doesn't. So what now? What? And so it's, and he didn't fire him. No. Mueller continued the work there, and then designed the Draco and Super Draco engines, and continued to work. So I think there have been news reports where like Musk saw someone's code at Tesla and got so upset, and he said, "Who wrote this? You're fired." But I think I could see myself doing that too. If someone wrote really shitty code on something that's a critical system, I might fire them.
Yeah.
Really. Because you don't want someone who's doing that in who knows what else they're writing. But that doesn't mean that person is a toxic leader.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. You have to look at the whole picture. I've seen videos of even Elon Musk conducting discussions where he's very kind of gentle and inquisitive, and he has a room full of engineers, and he says, "This is the problem. What should we do about it?" And they kind of talk it through. And so, I don't know. Again, I don't work there, but a lot of times we read things in the news and jump to conclusions, and I just want to be careful that I don't do that.
Yeah, I'm closer to your view than you might think the way I framed that question. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to talk about is, the particular anecdotes of him telling people, rage firing and all this stuff. Most of them are centered around what he calls production hell, that moment in time when they had 500,000 reservations for the Model 3 and no way to build them.
Right.
And so, I know that you look a bit askance at the idea of a Cynefin, but I sort of look at the time when they were doing the Model 3 production ramp as chaotic in the strictest sense of the Cynefin, this idea that there are times when you push and things come back instead of going forward, where the cause and effect aren't very clear. And it's under those circumstances that you get into, and there's an insight from Agile 2. Sorry, it's in here somewhere. That in the leadership taxonomy, you include command and control, right? This idea that under certain, under the military under fire conditions, sometimes you just have to tell people to do it, right? And one of the quotes that comes from that period is in Wired magazine. You referred to this article as well. And there's a beautiful quote in there where somebody went to Elon and said, nobody came up with a great idea when they were being chased by a tiger. I don't know if you remember that from the article. But you know what? If I'm being chased by a tiger, I have exactly one idea. And it's a good one, right? And I think that under those circumstances, and we can argue about whether Elon should be putting his companies in these circumstances, but when it's do or die, you're not going to be Socratic. You're not going to have a committee. You're going to tell people to do it. And if they're like, oh, but Elon, if we do that 6 months from now, no, do it. Because we won't exist in 6 months if you don't do it.
Yeah.
So
urgency is a big factor, and it's not all or nothing. It's again, it depends. It's a judgment.
It's circumstantial. Yeah.
Yeah, because in flight crews, in airplanes, there's actually a kind of framework for that where, if you have a crisis and, the captain takes over from the co-pilot, says, the plane is mine. That's what Sully Sullenberg said when he landed in the Hudson River.
Right.
The plane is mine. And he took control and landed. But, because seconds mean life or death, and there's no time to discuss. But, even in that situation, you should still be listening. If someone says you're doing the wrong thing, you should be listening because they might be right.
Yeah.
And, so if you think there's a fire because the fire alarm goes off, you might shout, everybody get out as soon as you can. But then someone might say, wait, no, listen, it's just a test. Oh, okay. Not everybody get out.
Yeah.
And like a fire chief at a fire, they might in their radio say, okay, you go here, you go here, you do that. And they need people to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone says, I don't think that's a good idea, because they should listen. So, product development is different because there isn't this huge sense of urgency, but there is some urgency. Time is really important in business. The Agile community often doesn't recognize that dimension of the problem. A group of people, developing consensus, well, there might not be time to get consensus. And so like Rasky gives the example actually of Elon Musk, where, there's a meeting and it's the only meeting they had. And Elon Musk says, after he hears what people think, so everyone's given their opinion, including Rasky. And he says, we're going to do that. And the meeting's over. So, he made a decision as the lead, but, again, they make choices with 50% probability of success. That's good enough. And if it doesn't work out, they backtrack.
Right.
And if the wrong call was made, there's no, oh, you made the wrong call, you're fired and all that. It's, oh, okay, we learned from that. Now we do better next time.
So
decision making is really important. In order to move things along in a timely way, very often you need someone to just make a decision. But you should first hear what everybody has to say and respect what everybody has to say.
So I actually picked up on that story as well and thought it was a really interesting one. And I did discuss it with a friend who had somewhat of a different reaction, because I'm accustomed to yearning for quick decision making. But the reaction was, that's great. Elon, the emperor, gets to make a decision at the end of the meeting and send everybody going. But what about the people who weren't at the meeting, who didn't get a voice, didn't get a chance to pitch in? What about the other people, even at the meeting, who felt like, well, if Elon's decided, I can't say anything? And so in Agile too, there's a principle: provide leadership who can both empower individuals and teams and set direction. And this is classic Agile too, in that there's an and in there. There's this idea that you have to balance between two extremes. How would you think through the strength of the way Elon just makes decisions and says, let's move on, versus the risk that you're making the wrong decision?
Yeah. So, I want to emphasize again that it's not about celebrating the person. And I'm not saying Elon is a model for everyone to emulate at all. He has strengths and he has weaknesses. And, I don't presume to know how to do things better than he does. He certainly gets results. But I think in that instance, he clearly does have preferences, for how to do things. And I think you're right that, in a meeting, and this is an issue that's really near and dear to me, because indeed in that meeting, my opinion might not have been heard. I know you're interviewing me one-on-one, but in a group of people, I tend to sit back and not contribute much, because other people take over. And by the time I decide what I think is best, the conversation's moved on. So I tend to mostly just not say much in meetings. And so my opinion probably wouldn't have been heard.
Right.
I believe, good collaboration, a good leader to make good decisions. And you do want groups to make decisions when they can. So I don't want to dismiss that. That's very important, because then people are invested in the idea and so on. But sometimes you're kind of out of time. And so a decision needs to be made and someone needs to just arbitrate. And that doesn't make you bad. As long as you view it, as long as you own the decision, and,
Mm-hmm.
and as long as you view it as, well, we'll try that, but a leader, to be able to make a good decision, you have to hear every opinion, or you have to hear the range of opinions and have good information and have time to think it through well. And if you're not getting the brains of people who don't contribute well in meetings, you're missing out.
Right.
So good collaboration, again, is not a meeting. Good
Right.
collaboration might include a meeting, might include many meetings, but good collaboration about complex issues often involves emails, a white paper, to reading, thinking, one-on-one chats, a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Good collaboration over time about complex issues over time. It's not just a meeting.
Well, so there's a couple of interesting things about that particular meeting. The way Dan Rasky described it was, like you were saying, Dan was sitting there watching the meeting, and it took Elon to call on him.
He asked him,
right? So he wasn't leaving anybody. I mean, Dan was there particularly about thermal protection systems, so It was a natural ask. But presumably the others did have a chance to speak, and then he turned to him. So I see your point there.
That's really important. That's really important because, some people spend more time. I don't know if you ever read the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow.
It's not a surprise to me that you're a fan of it too, because a lot of what you're talking about in Agile too is like thinking fast and thinking slow. Like sometimes you need a system, and sometimes you need to rethink that system. It's a gem.
Yeah, it is. And it really kind of explained a lot of things to me. But, I think some people in conversation stay in system one, and other people immediately jump to system two. And I think Elon Musk is someone who jumps to system two. Because if someone says, like to Elon Musk, how are you doing today? He won't say, oh, yeah, I'm doing great.
You can see the wheels turning for about 30 seconds.
Yeah. And think, how am I really doing? And he'll start thinking, like, where am I in my life? And he'll start thinking of first principles. How am I really doing? And then like 10 seconds later, he might decide, okay, I better say something before they leave. And then he'll give you an answer. And a lot of people are like that. And so if you have a discussion meeting, you see a bunch of people that are kind of silent, and they're the ones who tend to snap to system two. And very often they lag behind the discussion. They're still thinking about what was talked about 2 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't ask them what they think, you'll miss all of that.
Just as a fun anecdote related to that, there was an interview of Elon on stage. I think it was at Stanford by Steve Jurvetson, who is a venture capitalist. And so Steve asked Elon, and this is, I think, 2018-ish. He asked Elon, so if you could go back in time, what would you tell a younger Elon? And Elon sat there for about 10 seconds and then said,
right.
On balance, I think things have turned out pretty well. He was on the cusp of being the richest person on the planet. I think he was right, but he took 10 seconds to come to that conclusion.
Yeah. If you watch an interview, if you watch an interview of him, I am completely sure that if Elon Musk hadn't become wealthy at a young age, he'd be, he would, and he was working in some company, he'd be someone no one pays any attention to.
Mm-hmm.
No one would pay, that guy, he's an engineer over in that group and he wants to go to Mars. He's kind of a nut, And in meetings, no one would pay attention because he wouldn't say anything. He'd be like, finally they go, Elon, what do you think? And he'd come up with something that sounds like it's from left field because he's going back to first principles. So, he's someone who no one would pay any attention to if he were not empowered by his wealth. We would be losing out on this brilliance because he doesn't have a charismatic personality that makes other people listen to him. People listen to him because of who he is and what he's doing.
It's funny you say that because he was on stage at one point and he said, I don't think it was even something he was asked. I think he just led to it himself. But he said that if Nikola Tesla applied for a job at Tesla, he probably wouldn't hire him. And you could the expression on his face was that he suddenly realized that maybe he needed to rethink through his hiring practices, that it just triggered that first principles in his own mind.
Yeah, because Nikola Tesla went to an obscure university and I think had kind of a sketchy academic career.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have a typical illustrious background, but he obviously was very brilliant.
Yeah.
Elon Musk personally interviews, or at least up until they had 3,000 people, he would personally interview every job candidate.
Yeah. That's an amazing commitment. And for somebody who I was saying earlier is not a fan of HR, that's an HR practice, right? And it gets into something I've heard you mention before, is the idea of Agile HR practices, which many people in large organizations are not familiar with.
Well, HR as traditional HR is pretty friggin' broken. HR in most companies really exists to protect the company from lawsuits and to make sure the company's in compliance with laws and regulations. That's really its only purpose. It's not there for the employee, really. It pretends to be, but it's really not.
Yeah.
There are movements to kind of reinvent HR. One of them is people ops, and the idea of people ops is to more to better align HR with goals and to take account of what motivates people and how to help people to flourish so that it's for everyone's benefit, including the organization. To kind of embed HR more in an operational context. That's highly relevant today because we have a skills shortage. And, today you can't hire all the skills you need because they're changing all the time.
Right.
People in the software field are familiar with this. Every time they start a new project, they half of the things they've never done before. That's the norm. People in IT are used to that. Every time you start a new project, okay, I've used that and that, but I've never used any of those things. So they're used to that. And so, if companies try to hire everything they need, they won't be able to hire anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to think in terms of how do we fill the pipeline with skills, and not just by hiring, but by getting people the right experience, by giving them right challenges, by giving them training, by asking them what they're interested in so that they can actually then work in that area. It means you have to take someone away from their current project, which means their project manager might not like that, but move them into another area so they can learn something that they want to learn. HR definitely needs to be re-envisioned.
Yeah, and that's that builds on the idea of self-organization. Maybe self-organization isn't quite the right word, but definitely fluid organization. The ability to say, well, it turns out Cliff not only knows fluid dynamics, but he's also got a background in stainless steel, right? But you might be on the fluid dynamics team, and that team has deadlines to beat, and you're not welcome to move on or even be seconded to this other role. And so how you create that fluidity. And it's interesting that we're talking about that fluidity because the agile mindset is that people are liquid, right? They show up and they can do anything and they can join any team. And you're sort of saying, well, hold the phone. There does need to be some organizing structure as well. So you've examined that tension on how you create flexibility. It's coming back to this silo idea. What are the practices that a company can follow to, I guess, in the shortest way of phrasing it, allow people to migrate within an organization and still get stuff done?
Yeah. So that's a really important thing. Agilists often blame hierarchy, but hierarchy is not the problem. You need hierarchy because that's how you divide up funds. But the hierarchy gets in the way because issues today that come up often cut across teams and cut across product lines. Like that example you just mentioned. Where someone wants to learn about, I forget which way you had it, the materials or the fluid dynamics, So they're working in a certain area, but they want to learn about the other area. And the company realizes at a higher level, they realize that there are important products coming where they're going to need people who know that other area. So they do want to move that person, but that would undermine, that would harm where they currently are. So there's a trade-off. The decision's not clear. There are many factors, and a contextual decision needs to be made that looks both short-term and long-term. It needs to balance those things. There's no right answer. It depends. And so that's an example of what I like to call a cross-cutting issue that has arisen. It's arisen out of nowhere. If you let that bubble up to a hierarchy, for your quarterly planning, that's too slow.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as that issue occurs, someone needs to notice it, which means there's a manager who's watching.
Right.
Or, maybe that employee says something, but I don't give that high likelihood. The employee might say to their HR, I want to learn about this or something. But someone who has some authority needs to hear about it and decide to take action. And the action can't be hierarchical because it's a cross-cutting issue. So managers, like the way Elon Musk is always watching everything and always asking questions. What's happening today? What's going on? What's in the way? What's new? What are the issues? That constant probing to identify new issues that arise is critical part of leadership. It's actually part of transformational leadership. Intellectual stimulation is an important element of transformational leadership. And the intellectual stimulation is about asking hard questions and about knowing what's going on and stimulating dialectic discussion. Yeah. So a transformational leader will notice these issues, will detect them. I call that a leadership an issue detector. But then what do you do? What do you do? And what often has to happen today, because the hierarchy is too slow, is you need to identify who in the organization might be affected and reach out to those areas and put a little team together to work that issue today.
Right.
Not next planning session, but starting today. Just like in Rasky related that example of he noticed there was a problem and he stood up and looked around and, is that person at their desk? Because I really need to talk to them. Yeah. Just like that, but in a larger context. Imagine you have 10,000 people in the company. And, so you want to change this product, but this product is used by another product. Yeah. That's very common. Products are not silos. Mm-hmm. Products, companies interact with a part of a product suite. So if you change your product, you might break another product.
Yep.
And so, if this engineer who knows the materials wants to work in fluid dynamics, you're harming one product to help another. So it might be the right choice, so you need to identify who's affected, have them work the issue, but then a decision needs to be made. And that's where leadership comes in. There needs to be someone leading that issue. And that person needs to be someone who has the organization's interest at heart, not their team's. That's where servant leadership breaks down because it's too focused on the team. You need to be someone who's focused on what's the best global outcome, systems thinking.
Right.
And that means incentives need to be aligned. Then means the culture needs to be non-competitive. So there are all these elements that have to be in place for it to work well.
So one of the elements that Elon relies on is company-wide memos. And one of them said, if you have, first of all, this isn't a memo, but something he said to his teams often is everybody's head engineer. You have to think about the whole thing. And that's an Agile 2 principle. You have to think about the whole thing. And that empowers people to think that way, to not just be focused on their parochial interest. And then the other element is the company-wide memo that said, if your manager is preventing you from talking to somebody else elsewhere in the organization, that manager's fired. That manager needs to work somewhere else. You couldn't be more explicit than that. And this brings us back to, it links a couple of things that you've raised. One is that story that Dan told about the bulkhead not being strong enough for the purpose it was being designed for. And that team had an option. They could spend 6 months redesigning that part, or they could talk to a neighboring structure, which was the thermal protection system, and say, look, you've got extra strength. You got more strength than you need. Can we literally lean on your part with our part? And the answer was yes. And that is first of all, an unusual a conversation to have, I should think, but also one that requires everybody involved to be really looking at the overall goal. And it struck me the way he described that story. It wasn't a higher somebody higher in the organization. It was
Right.
a sense of a higher purpose.
Yes, right. They didn't
And
have
furthermore, and
Right.
furthermore, he said that he attributed it to what you pointed out earlier. People are a little bit underpaid, but there's a generous option package. And so, whereas you might say, well, my bonus is tied to me having a very strong thermal protection system structure. No, your bonus is tied to the whole fate of the organization. So think twice before you reject the plea of
Right.
another department. And there's a couple of insights or a couple of things from Agile too that I want to just sort of put on the table. One is that collections of technical teams do not automatically collaborate. That's right out of Agile too. So you have to create the circumstance for that. And then the other thing, it's I think a very early thing you raise is always think holistically in terms of the whole system. So what's your reaction to that? And do you see that in other organizations? Do you see examples of that?
Yeah. So, SpaceX is a little bit unique, as Rasky points out, in that there is this overriding mission. And, so not every organization is going to be able to duplicate that, because not every organization has a great sense of purpose. I mean, some are in it just to make money, or, they might have a product, but, it's not a product that's going to like solve world hunger or put people on Mars or something like that. It's just like, it's a good product, but, it's a business. And so, you can't expect that everybody is going to have like, a sense of purpose, like Daniel Pink's drive mechanism, one
Start with why, all these Simon Sinek. Yeah.
Yeah, but he basically says the things that motivate people are, there's like the sense of purpose, and then, plus a sense of doing your job really well. Like I forget the term he uses, and then empowerment, that you feel like a sense of autonomy. So like the first one, like that kind of inspiration element. A lot of organizations can't provide that because what they're doing is not all that inspiring. But they can provide the other things. But if the job itself is just not that inspiring, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Everyone like to work for an inspiring company, but most companies aren't that inspiring. You work for a bank, so you work for a bank. Why is that inspiring? It's basically
it's the look on the face when you give a new customer a toaster.
Yeah, right. So if it's not inspiring, then what motivates that one group to sacrifice its interest for another group?
Right.
And so, and they're probably not being paid huge amounts of stock. They're probably being paid a salary because, it's a public company already. And, SpaceX is a private company and you can't just hand out stock. And so anyway, so you have to have a different way of motivating people to make a holistic decision, and, that comes down to, as individuals, they might not have a motivation to, because there is no overriding vision or goal or dream or something because of the nature of the business. So that means that leadership has to be motivated to make sure that, like, whoever is helping to resolve that issue, and they have to be thinking holistically. So maybe their incentive needs to be based on overall OKRs or something like that. It's an important element. I feel that organizations need to, when they do organization design, they need to do leadership design. It needs to be part of it. They need to think what are the clusters of issues that we tend to need leadership about? How do we make sure that there is leadership about those issues happening? And it doesn't necessarily mean we assigned people, it just means, is it happening? And what styles of leadership? Are people like autocratic jerks, or are they, are they supportive leaders, inquisitive and supportive leaders? So, organizations and what motivations do the leaders have? So, and how are we motivating them, and how are we measuring them and incentivizing them and so on? And how are we, it extends beyond the leaders. How are we motivating and incentivizing everyone? So, it's a complicated question, and not everyone can solve it the way SpaceX does. Sometimes you need, I don't want to go on this one question forever, but I'll give another example. I worked for someone a long time ago who I felt was, like, in my career, the best project manager I ever had. I've even written an article about it. And his name was Carl, and he was not inspiring at all. And, so it wasn't like, oh, we have a great dream, we're trying to change the world, or anything like that. It was a job. But we loved Carl not because he was a real likable guy. He was okay, but, he wasn't funny or anything. He didn't trade good stories. He wasn't very personable, actually. But Carl's
at home waiting for a butt.
Right.
Yeah.
But he was inquisitive, and he made good decisions, and he would talk to everybody every day. Every day he'd come into my office, because we had our own offices back then. And he'd say, how are you doing? What are you working on? How's that going to work? He didn't just want to know, what am I doing? He wanted to know, how's it going to work? And he would ask in a supportive way, not in like a critical, how's that going to work? He would say, okay, how's that going to work? What do you plan to do? Okay, interesting. You might want to consider this. Okay, and you might want to go talk to Joe because he's working on something related. I said, okay, well, good talking to you. I'll check and, see you later. And he'd leave. And I felt like when he left, I had just talked to someone who was really interested in what I'm doing and really interested in helping. Yeah. That's the impression I got. So, he wasn't inspirational, but, because he was supportive, and he tended to make good decisions because he'd ask people what they thought before he made a decision.
Right.
And he didn't micromanage you. He didn't tell you how to do your job. He let you come and go when you pleased and do your work your own way. If you had to make a decision that, like, sacrifice something for your team to benefit another team, I could imagine, what would Carl say we should do? And I know Carl would want to do the best thing. Mm-hmm. And so I would probably behave the way I thought Carl thought I should behave. He provided a model.
Yeah, modeling matters for sure.
Yeah.
So let me move on to a story about Tesla, which is another one of Elon Musk's companies, electric vehicle company. And this is a bit of a saga. Let me get it on the table and then I'll get your thoughts on it. Electric vehicles are relatively new, and there's optimization to be done to improve the capability, but also lower the costs. And one of the challenges of electric vehicles is you want to heat the cabin or cool the cabin. Same with the battery, same with the motor, same with the in-car electronics. And if you look at a Mustang Mach-E, there's a hose for everything and a radiator for everything and a pump for everything. Whereas the later Teslas have been very optimized around a single heat pump for heating and cooling with the outside air, a single valve that controls refrigerant and coolant to make sure that if you need heat inside, but you want to cool the battery or vice versa, you can do all these things very efficiently and with very low part count. And this is a classic example to me of being able to look beyond silos. Somebody had to say, why are there 4 radiators in this car? We only need maybe 1 or 2. How do we get people together to really look at this issue together? So I think that's a laudable example of silo breaking, but it's also unproven. And there are stories in and one of the things about Tesla that people in the know, like I don't know if you've heard of Sandy Munro, but his company tears apart cars for the explicit purpose of figuring out how much they cost, how they're put together, what technology's in them. He does YouTube videos on this, but he also sells the results to other car makers. So it's a pretty good living if you're interested in how cars are made. And where was I going with that? Well,
about the holistic, about Tesla.
Yeah,
one of everything instead of 10 different things for every part.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot. I lost my track there. But basically, sorry. The point he was making is his observation is that Tesla is making modifications to their car design like every week, every day, maybe.
Right.
And that's unprecedented. Generally speaking, you make a mid-cycle refresh every 2 years, and then a new model 4 years, and then a whole redesign every 12 years, that kind of cycle, right? But they're doing it daily.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the complaints recently is that Tesla's in northern climes, I'm in Canada, but it's not that cold here. It's only, minus 20. But in Alberta, it was minus 40. In Saskatchewan, it was minus 40.
During the day?
During the day, yeah.
Oh my God.
And so the Model Y and Model 3 with the heat pump was not generating heat. It was failing. And so 10, 20 people complained about this. There are people in Norway with the same experience. And the reactions were polarized, as everything about Elon Musk is. One is, they're going to fix it in a week. How brilliant is Tesla for being able to react to this? Whereas you've heard stories about Hondas that don't create heat. And it took them they had to rebuild the car. They had to, change the engine to fix that problem. Whereas Tesla's going to be able to fix this with a software update. So brilliant Tesla. But the other reaction was, this is a safety risk. How can you put cars out there that can't defrost their windows? How can you put cars out there that might kill their occupants from the cold? Very different reaction. And so one of the Agile 2 principles is obtain feedback from the market and stakeholders continuously. And that is a claim to fame for Tesla. They just push it out. They'll make, rolling off the assembly line, the cars are not identical. Right. They're really sort of saying, back in the day, it used to be cars were not identical because they were hand built. Then they were built by machines. They were all the same. Now they're being built with computers involved that can handle the discrepancies, right? And so they're sort of beta testing all the time, but they're beta testing in customers' hands. What are your thoughts on that? Where would you draw the line if you were running Tesla on how much to put the testing in customer hands versus the 6 million miles we put on a BMW before we sell it to the public?
Yeah, well, I think it's a matter of balancing risk. The public doesn't want to be a guinea pig generally for anything that's like important. I know if I'm using my phone while I'm driving, which you're not supposed to do, and I don't anymore because I plug it in, but I used to have to look at it for the map. And if I wanted to use it and I'm driving and I call up the map thing and the interface is different, I could have a car accident trying to figure out, why is the interface different than it was yesterday? Where's the friggin' button to find the route? So people don't want things that are changing all the time. They don't. So there's that. And, I'm not sure about Tesla, but I know SpaceX is sensitive to this because they have different approaches for their different vehicles. They launch human beings on the Falcon 9 rocket in the Dragon crew capsule. And they have far more rigorous testing for that. Generally, it's a spectrum. The Agile community talks about experimentation, which is really good, but you don't want to, if you fail, you could go out of business or someone could die, So you need to look at what is the actual risk of failing in production. What's the actual risk? And if the risk is high, you cannot fail. It means you need to make the failure upstream. You need to fail in a test setting. And this is not black and white. It's a trade-off. Like right now, SpaceX, I'm going back to the SpaceX example because I've studied them. I haven't studied Tesla, but SpaceX is testing a new vehicle, this Starship system, and they, at some point they decide when is it ready to fly, to test it, and it might crash. Mm-hmm. So when it crashes, they lose a lot of money. Yeah. It took a lot of money to build that stainless steel thing with the Raptor engines and everything, but it's a trade-off, and if they spend a year designing, that's a trade-off too. They lose time, and so there's a learning trade-off versus how much they lose if it actually fails. And that point is different for every product. And figuring out where that trade-off point is, that's a judgment. That's a critical judgment to make. If human lives are involved, or maybe people might freeze to death in their car, that changes the equation. You should be moving the failure point upstream to before it gets into actual people's hands.
So I have taken us right to the limit of our time. I have a couple of questions left. Do you want me to skip to the last one, or do you have time to stick around for a little bit?
I have time.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, my wife's driving back from New York, so but she won't be here for a while, so I've got time.
All right, thank you. So how did Agile 2 come about? Let me hear a little bit more about Agile 2 and the thought process that went into that, and how you see it as being different from Agile.
Yeah, sure. Well, I do a lot of consulting, and I had been hearing, before the pandemic, I'd started to hear, I also do a lot of DevOps work, and I teach DevOps in various different ways. I have my own course. I teach some other courses in DevOps, and I've done a lot of DevOps consulting too. I've helped organizations to get DevOps strategies, but I'd started hearing organizations today, they often they will create an Agile strategy again, because the organizations over time, they go through many Agile strategies, and then they try again, and then they try again. And each time they create a new Agile strategy. And now it usually includes DevOps. And I started to hear managers grumbling, well, we need to hire Agile coaches and DevOps engineers. What if we just get DevOps engineers? So then we don't have to have two different kinds of things we have to go find, and I became concerned because I think Agile is really important. But, at the same time, I kind of could relate to it, because I feel like from very early on, the Agile movement kind of derailed. When Agile came out, I was CTO of a company. We had about 200 people. And to me, it was wonderful. It was oh, this is great, because it's getting back to what used to work, small teams and incremental delivery. And those all made sense. And those weren't new ideas by any means. But during the 90s, I like to call the 90s the methodology craze. Suddenly you saw all these methodologies and things became waterfallish. They weren't before.
Right.
And so 90s became was very toxic for software development, and Agile kind of turned the clock back. But then Agile derailed. It got taken over by Scrum and by all kinds of weird extremes, everyone should self-organize, and self-organize, there's a kind of a kernel of a good idea in there. It really is about empowering people and giving them autonomy over how they do their job. That's good. But people took it to an extreme. Oh, every team should self-organize. No, that's not going to work. Not most of the time. Yeah. Are you kidding? My wife's a behavioral therapist. And when I told her about it, she looked at me like I was nuts, because she knows about human behavior. There are behavioral theory models and leadership models that will tell us why it doesn't work, like LMX theory. does very clearly why self-organization tends to not work.
Did you say LMX?
LMX, leader member exchange theory. It basically what tends to happen in a group is someone emerges as the leader, and then an inner circle forms around that person. It even happens with chimpanzees.
Right.
Well,
that is Jeff Bezos's idea about 2 pizza meetings, right? Anything beyond what you can feed with 2 pizzas, you wind up with somebody who self-proclaims as a leader.
Well, it even happens with a 1 pizza group. If you take a group of 5 people, 1 or 2 will emerge as kind of like the top dog in the group. It almost always happens. It doesn't always happen, but it usually happens. And it's very often it's benign. It's like someone with just the best of intentions, but not always, especially in an organization. It might be someone who like wants to demonstrate that like they're in charge so that they get promoted or something. It depends. But this kind of communistic idea that everyone self-organizes in this egalitarian way, that's not really how human behavior works. What tends to happen is tacit power structures emerge. Lines of communication, where people like tend to always like collaborate together versus, and you end up with, and if you go back in time, Max Weber famously wrote about hierarchy as a solution to that. To organizations that were structureless were known for nepotism and favoritism and all this stuff. But anyway, where did this start?
Well, I was basically, I think you were getting into the genesis of Agile 2.
Oh, Agile 2, yeah. So anyway, so I had real concerns about the Agile movement, which I thought was really important and was a really good thing, but I felt like the movement got co-opted by special interests, certification mills and these frameworks that were really rigid and kind of lost the intention.
The true agility.
Yeah, and even like Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas were saying back in 2002, what the heck's going on? We didn't say no documents, we didn't say no design, what the heck is going on here? So I felt like the movement had really kind of run astray, so the movement was kind of broken to me. Agile, a lot of Agile thinking was broken because it had become extreme and simple-minded and like more extreme is better, like mob programming, a lot of people, some people like it. That's great, but it's not for everyone. And, people who are fans of it, often they champion it as if, it's what everyone should doing. And if you're not doing it, then there's something wrong with you.
Right.
Well, no, it's something.
What they mean is you're not just like me.
Yeah, exactly. Because, some people, in groups don't think well. I don't think well in a group, because we talked about that before. I'll sit back and kind of lose the thread of what people are talking about, and so we need to respect that. We need to respect the diversity of the way people think and work and everything. But anyway, Agile originally was about empowering individuals, I think was the intention. I think that was the intention of it. It wasn't intended to be this extreme thing. Everybody self-organize or else.
Right.
So when the pandemic, so I already had concerns about Agile. I felt Agile was really important, but I had deep concerns about it. And I felt like, it kind of like was really in trouble because people, it wasn't working. It wasn't working in a lot of organizations. And so if an alternative like DevOps came to perceived as an alternative, people would say, forget Agile, we'll just do DevOps. And then we'll lose the focus on the human side of things, which is really important, And so when the pandemic started, I thought, what, let's make lemonade. This is a good time. Yeah. And the pandemic kind of is proving that people can work remotely, by the way.
Yes.
Which, so you don't all have to be in the same room, and it can still work. Being together in the same room is really great in some ways, but in other ways it's not. I can't focus in a team room. I absolutely cannot focus in a team room. I have to leave. I'll go somewhere else. I'll go to the cafe where no one knows who I am and put my headphones on. So anyway, so I put a group together. And the two main criteria, so I put out a call for who's interested, but the two main criteria were you had to have demonstrated that you think for yourself, rather than just parroting, oh, everybody use Scrum or everybody do this and mob programming. Basically, cheering on like fad practices.
Recipes.
I didn't want recipes. And so people who are like critical thinkers, I wanted. And number two, you could not be heavily invested in the status quo. So if like Jeff Sutherland had emailed me and said, I heard about this Agile 2, what are you doing? Can I join it? I would have said, thanks, but no, because you're too heavily invested in what's going on now. And frankly, what's going on now is broken. You're part of the reason. But anyway, twice the work and half the time. Okay, yeah. But anyway, so those were the two main criteria, and then I had a small group at that point, and we decided how to conduct it, and we created a matrix of skills we wanted, and so we recruited people who met the criteria but had those skills, and the skills included like product design and program management and human resources and DevOps and Agile and system engineering and all these things, and found 15 people. We actually found 18 people, and the three ended up, two dropped out, and one I had to remove because he was disruptive. Actually a nice guy, but he became kind of difficult for everybody. But anyway, so then we started as a retrospective, basically. But we were global, spanning Vietnam, India, UK, Australia, US, so we couldn't have a group meeting. It wasn't possible. And not even on Zoom, we couldn't have a group meeting. And so we had to embrace what GitLab likes to call asynchronous communication. GitLab is a big proponent of asynchronous collaboration. They have a whole website on it. And we had to do things that way. We had no choice.
Right.
It's not like we decided we want to do things that way. We had to do things that way. And which is kind of the new norm. If we're going to work globally, we kind of have to move to that for better or worse. It's the only way to be global. But we ended up with this team, and we first discussed through, and so I set up many communication paths because I didn't know which people we're going to use. I set up Slack, I set up a Google Drive, I set up an email group in Gmail, and I set up something I'm missing. There was another one.
Maybe a standing Zoom chat or something.
We couldn't do that.
Well, but even just with the people who could, like, divide it up a little.
No one suggested that. No one suggested that. But there were a lot of Zoom one-on-ones. I personally did 2 Zooms with everybody, and I put on my Socrates hat. I asked questions. I didn't say, I never voiced my opinion. I only asked questions, and I took notes, and then I published those notes for the group. Because I wanted to get everybody's thoughts about what do you think is working and not working. And we ended up with this list, and then we discussed the list mostly through email, some people in Slack and some in Google Docs, but mostly email. Email ended up being 90% of the conversation, I would say, just how it turned out. And deeply nested, we'd have people using like 15 different colors, deeply nested emails. Yeah. Some people like that, and some people couldn't follow that. And so what I did was very laborious. I would copy what people said into Google Docs. I would have to read through.
You have to roll it up for them. Yeah.
Oh God, I was spending all day doing that, copying people's opinions and putting it into a structure, into a Google Doc. And the two issues that ended up being contentious were the whole introvert-extrovert issue and how people collaborate. That ended up being very contentious. And the leadership from the point of view of self-organization ended up being contentious. So those ended up becoming, there were several issues that ended up getting their own issue document, maybe like 10 of them, where we actually created a document to talk through an issue. And so that ended up being very hierarchical and different points. And what do you think about this? And, this relates to that. And so finally we got consensus. I basically was the facilitator, and we finally got consensus on things basically. And then we had a contest of drafting a roll-up of that into principles. We first rolled that up and there were like 100 principles. Well, that was too many. So we had a contest to distill that. And I came up with one, but the one we ended up using was drafted by Raj Nagapam. He was one of the group. And we voted on that. And we had to get, if we couldn't get 100% consensus, we would talk through why are we not consensus on this. So we ended up with 100% consensus on those principles. And we also took our retrospective items and grouped them under the relevant principle, so that you could see the reasoning behind the principle. This principle is here because we felt there were these problems and we had these realizations and so on related to this principle. So you could see the why.
Right.
And then we wrote, and we already had, I think at that point, narrative explaining the principle. So it wasn't just like a statement, a naked statement. It actually said, this principle, but then it actually had an explanation of what the principle means. And then it had the retrospective items under. If you go to this, it's a lot of content. If you go to the site.
The website is very rich. That was a great fishing hole for questions today, for sure.
And there is a summary. If you go to the site under resources, there's a selection, Agile 2 in a nutshell. There's a one-pager that kind of summarizes Agile 2. Yeah.
So I work at a university in computing, and of course, one of the challenges we've had recently is this sudden move to everybody being online, same as everyone else, but it had some facets of staff, students, faculty. They all were impacted in different ways. One of the exciting things, both as a podcast host and as somebody working under those circumstances, is when you are mediating most of your communication through the computer, all of a sudden you're talking to people who really share your specific interests as opposed to a coffee pot down the hall, right? And that this book is that writ large. I mean, you're talking about people around the globe. But what strikes me is you're applying Agile 2 principles to the process of writing a book about Agile 2. And so my question is, and this is the last question, I promise you. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. The last question is, did your thinking about what Agile 2 should be change as a result of applying it to coming up with the book? And what lessons did you learn?
Well, not the book. I mean, my own thinking changed in the course of developing Agile 2.
Agile 2, sorry. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Definitely. I changed my own mind about those two contentious issues. My opinion ended up being shifted on those two things. Personally, I'm sure there are others who had a learning experience too. But it definitely did move my own thinking. There were some individuals who were steadfast in their disagreement, about those issues. And so we had to talk it through. And it required like really peeling the onion. Why do you think this? Why do you think that? And so that leads to that. Why do you think that? And what's your assumption there? And we had to really decompose like especially for the leadership issue, we had to really decompose. And that's how we ended up with a leadership taxonomy, which is on the website. But, I mean, we're not claiming is that like, we don't put any attention on that. We had to create it in order to have the discussion about leadership. That's why we have that. And so we kind of pulled out leadership into a lot of different dimensions and situations. And, I felt like I learned a lot through that process from some of the other members. Yeah.
Cliff, thank you. I have learned a lot from this conversation. I'm grateful you came on the show.
Thank you, Tim. It was a great pleasure. Yeah.
My guest today was Cliff Berg. A link to Cliff's LinkedIn profile and the Agile 2 website and the videos of Dr. Dan Rasky from NASA will be in the show notes. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.